You lost count of how many people's problems you solved this week. It wasn't a request for help you chose to answer. It was a phone ringing. And before you even looked at the name, part of you already knew. Nobody calls to ask how you are. They call to hand you what they cannot carry alone. And you pick up. You always pick up. Because picking up is what you do. It's who you are. It's the position you've held since before you can remember choosing to hold it. You cannot remember the last time you said I am not okay to someone and watched them stay. You remember trying once, maybe twice. You remember the silence that followed, the way the subject changed a little too fast, as if your weakness were an inconvenience that needed handling before it got in the way of the rest of the conversation. And you learned fast, learned deep, without anyone having to say it out loud. You learned that your place is on the side of the one holding things together, never on the side of the one being held. This did not happen in a single day. It settled in slowly, without ceremony, without one moment you could point to as the start. Once you were strong because someone needed you to be. Then you were strong because it started to feel natural. Then you were strong because nobody asked anymore whether you could keep being it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, strength stopped being a choice and became a fixed role, stitched onto you like a second skin you don't remember putting on. The people around you did not do this out of cruelty. Most of them never noticed they did it at all. They simply learned, the same automatic way you learn to hold everything, that you are the safe place to leave the weight. And a safe place doesn't need tending. A safe place only needs to be there, standing, ready. When someone arrives carrying something, Marcus Aurelius wrote every night about the roles men take on without ever noticing they took them on. He said a man can wear a mask for so long he forgets there's a face underneath it. You did not choose this role in one deliberate, conscious moment. It formed across 1,000 small ones, each seeming reasonable on its own, until it hardened into an identity nobody questions anymore, including you. Think about how many times you were the first call, the first person someone reaches for when the ground shifts, the sibling who deals with the bank, the friend who knows exactly what to do when somebody else's kid gets sick at 3 in the morning, the one holding the whole house, bright while everyone around you comes apart. Ranacha chiming front you waiting for it to point back, and you point. You always point. You have the right words to calm other people's panic, the cold clarity to separate what matters from what doesn't in the middle of a crisis, the presence that makes people breathe slower just by knowing you're in the room. That is not a small gift. It is rare. And because it's rare, nobody ever imagines it comes with a cost. Because while you're calming everyone else's storms, something inside you keeps going without anyone to calm it. You got so good at soothing other people's chaos that nobody ever asked who soothes yours. And after enough time doing that, you stopped asking yourself too. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only people carrying this role know. It is not the loneliness of being alone. You are rarely alone. Your schedule is full of people who need you. Your phone never stops. To almost everyone who knows you, you are intensely present. The loneliness I'm talking about is different. It's being surrounded by people and still being the only one in that entire network of relationships that nobody ever thinks to ask how they're doing underneath it all. And the strangest part is you started forgetting to ask yourself that too. There's a moment at the end of days like this when you're finally alone with no one left to hold up. And the first thing you feel isn't relief. It's an emptiness with no specific name, just a diffuse weight that sits there, unaddressed, with no one to blame, no precise scene you could point to as the cause. And there's something underneath this that almost never gets said out loud. The truth is you don't hold everything together because you're naturally stronger than the people around you. You hold it because, at some point in your life, you learned that being useful was the safest way to keep being wanted, that your fragility, if it ever surfaced, would cost too much to risk showing, that the love you receive is somehow, silently, tied to how much you can give without ever asking for anything back. Know those words nobody had too. You absorbed it from small scenes, repeated over years. Maybe from a childhood where showing need was treated as one more weight in a house that already had no room for more weight. Maybe from a time you finally broke down in front of someone and saw, on their fussy not can't discomfort, as if your pain were an inconvenience. Maybe from no single moment at all, just the quiet accumulation of learning, again and again, that the value you hold for people is directly tied to how much you can solve, endure, sustain. And so you built a version of yourself that never cracks. Because cracking in your internal system doesn't just mean showing weakness. It means risking the one position you're certain you occupy, the position of the reliable one, the one who never fails, the one who, if they disappeared, would leave everyone around them without ground under their feet. Seneca wrote in one of his letters that some men become slaves to the very thing others admire most in them. He wasn't talking about wealth or power. He was talking about virtue itself. Once it stops being a choice and becomes an obligation, nobody has the nerve to refuse. And that's exactly what happens to whoever carries the role of always being the strong one. Strength, which should be a resource you draw on when needed, becomes a quiet prison. You no longer choose to be strong. You fear what happens the moment you stop. If you watched the video about people who drain your energy, you'll recognize a similar mechanism here, seen from a different angle. Because whoever never learns to filter who gets access to their internal weight also never learns to filter how much of themselves they're willing to hand over without return. It's the same nameless cycle, except this time you're not just the one absorbing other people's weight. You're the one who accepted, without noticing, that this was supposed to be your only possible role. That comes with a cost that almost never shows on the surface. It isn't the obvious tiredness a weekend fixes. It's another kind of exhaustion, quieter, that doesn't come from physical effort but from never having a safe place to set down what you yourself are carrying. You learned how to ask questions that help other people find clarity in the middle of their chaos. But when you're the one in the middle of chaos, there's no one to ask. Because in almost everyone's mind around you, you don't have chaos. You're the place where other people's chaos goes to get resolved. There's a scene you might recognize with a specific kind of discomfort. You're in a circle of close friends, and someone finally asks, almost in passing, how you're doing, and before you can even catch it, the answer is already out, automatic. I'm good, all fine over here. And the conversation moves on, because nobody pushed, because nobody noticed that answer came out too fast to be true, because you rehearsed it for so long it fires before you even decide to say it. Nobody pushes because, underneath it all, everyone learned, right alongside you, that pushing wouldn't be necessary. You're the strong one. The strong one doesn't need to be asked twice. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should pay close attention to what we do out of habit and what we do out of choice, because most men live entirely inside the first, without ever noticing the second was possible. You didn't consciously, deliberately choose to never need anyone. You just repeated, long enough, the gesture of holding it alone, until the gesture became habit, and the habit became identity, and the identity became something you defend even while it's tearing you apart from the inside. There's a scene that happens in different forms, but always with the same undercurrent. Someone in the family goes through something serious, and before the news even finishes being told, you're already running through the next steps. Who needs to call who? What needs handling first? How to organize the chaos so it stops being chaos. You do it with a competence that impresses whoever's watching, a clarity that seems natural, as if you were born knowing how to manage other people's panic. And nobody stops to ask where that competence came from, what it cost to build, how many times you had to learn alone because there was no one doing it for you first. After the crisis gets solved, everyone else exhales and goes back to their life. Except you. You carry, for days, sometimes weeks, the residue of absorbing everyone's panic at once, without ever, at any point, having someone absorb yours. There's also the time you tried. Really tried. You chose one person, in a rare moment of nerve, and started saying things weren't okay. And halfway through the sentence, you caught it. A subtle discomfort on the other person's face, barely visible, but you recognized it instantly because you've spent your whole life reading signals like that in other people, and you closed the sentence faster than you'd planned. turned the confession into a passing comment. "It's fine, just a tiring day." And the conversation moved to something else, and nobody noticed the door that opened and shut again in under 10 seconds. You kept that scene, kept it as proof that trying isn't worth the risk. And every time that memory resurfaces, it reinforces the same silent conclusion. Better to keep holding it alone than risk that flash of discomfort on the face of someone you love. And that's exactly where the highest price of this role lives. Not the weight of holding others, the loneliness of never being invited to show that you need holding too. What makes it heavier is that nobody in your life would call themselves careless. They would say, honestly, that they care about you deeply, and they do. But caring about someone and noticing them are not the same skill, and most people were never taught the second one, especially towards someone who never gives them a reason to look closer. You built such a convincing surface of being fine that the people who love you most stopped checking underneath it, not out of neglect, but because you trained them, without meaning to, that there was nothing underneath worth checking. There is also the year everyone in your circle went through something at once. A parent's health scare, a friend's divorce, a sibling's job loss, all landing within months of each other, almost as if they'd coordinated it. And you were there for every single one. You showed up to the hospital waiting room. You helped draft the difficult email. You sat on the phone at midnight while someone cried about a marriage ending. People later called that year proof of how strong you are, how dependable, how lucky everyone around you is to have you. Nobody asked what that year cost you specifically, what you were carrying underneath all that showing up, because in their memory of that year, you were simply present, unaffected, solid. You remember it differently. You remember running on fumes for months, smiling through most of it, because falling apart in the middle of everyone else's crisis felt like the one thing you absolutely could not afford to do. There is also a real difference between strength and shutting down, even though from the outside they look identical. Real strength holds up someone else without needing to deny its own fragility. Shutting down holds up someone else by hiding its own fragility so well that, over time, even you forget where you stored it. You don't have to stop being the person everyone trusts. That's not the problem. The problem is building your entire identity on never needing anyone, as if needing were some kind of malfunction in you, instead of an unavoidable part of being human. Marcus Aurelius said the rational mind becomes truly strong not when it never yields, but when it honestly recognizes its own limit and acts within it, instead of pretending the limit doesn't exist. Recognizing the limit isn't the opposite of strength. It's the only kind of strength that lasts. Think of someone you genuinely admire, not for the image they project, but for the real depth you feel coming from them. Chances are that person has had visible moments of fragility too. Chances are they've told someone they trust at some point that they work a. And chances are that didn't lower your respect for them one bit. It probably raised it. So the standard you hold for yourself doesn't apply to them the same way. Maybe because somewhere far back, showing fragility cost you too much and cost that person nothing at all. Maybe because nobody ever taught you there's a version of strength that includes, instead of excludes, the right to need something too. There's a small scene that shows this more clearly than any explanation could. You're in the middle of a hard day. One of those where everything weighs more than it should, and the phone rings. Someone needing you, again. And for a second, before you answer, something in you wants to just not pick up this time. Just this once, but yeah. Because not answering feels unthinkable, feels like a betrayal of the role you built, feels like one failure and the whole structure comes down. And you hold it together one more time. And you end the day emptier than you started, with no exact word for what you're feeling, just a tiredness that isn't physical. That's the moment most people carrying this role decide, without realizing they're deciding, to keep going exactly as they are, because the alternative feels unimaginable. But there's another way, and it doesn't ask you to stop being reliable. It only asks you to stop confusing reliability with total self-sufficiency. You can keep being the person others turn to in a crisis, without being the only person who never has won. You can keep holding what's actually yours to hold, without carrying alone a weight that was never meant to be yours. Alone. It starts with something small, almost invisible, but it changes the entire architecture of how you exist inside your relationships. Choosing, deliberately, one person, just one, to whom you can tell the truth unedited, not the short, polite version of how you're doing, the real one. That is not weakness. It's probably the first time in a long time you've chosen something for yourself instead of simply reacting to what everyone else expects from you. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we don't need a crowd of witnesses to live according to our own nature. We just need enough honesty in front of ourselves and enough room for that honesty to reach someone we trust. You don't need to announce this shift to anyone. You don't need a speech about boundaries. And you don't need to suddenly stop helping people who depend on you. You just need to stop pretending, in front of at least one person, that you never crack. Nothing about your competence has to change. You can still be the one who stays calm when everyone else is unraveling, the one whose voice steadies a room. That part was never the problem. What changes is quieter than that. It's the private agreement you made with yourself years ago, that needing anything back would somehow cancel out everything you're able to give. That agreement was never true. It was just the only explanation available at the time, and you've been living inside it ever since, mistaking it for a fact about who you are, instead of a story you built to survive one particular moment. The price of always being the strong one isn't visible from the outside. No one around you sees how much you pay to keep that front intact. Only you know the size of the bill. But the price isn't permanent either. It exists because an architecture got built without you consciously choosing to build it. And what got built without a choice can, with time and care, be rebuilt with one. You don't have to stop holding up the world around you. You just have to stop doing it alone, in silence, as if asking for help were a malfunction instead of an unavoidable part of actually being human. If this reached you, write one word in the comments. Present, because maybe this is the first time someone asked and actually waited for the answer. Seneca wrote that no one is strong enough to carry alone what life hands to many to be shared.